People believed this aging, wounded beast was awaiting his end until he rose to defend a stranger he ought to have disregarded. The wilderness sun offered no pity that afternoon. Upon a solitary expanse of burnt earth, an elderly lion rested shattered, forsaken by his pride, lacking the power to battle and devoid of reasons to hope. His physique was collapsing. His moments were nearly finished. Then an event occurred that nobody could clarify. In his last seconds, when existence no longer mattered, the feline took a decision that would alter 2 lives permanently and bring weeping to millions. The wilderness did not hurry to end him. It merely paused. By midday, the warmth weighed upon the terrain like a leaden palm, leveling shadows and sapping color from all it grazed. The atmosphere trembled above the fissured ground, and even the breeze appeared too exhausted to stir. Under the scant cover of a limestone ledge lay a lion who lacked the vitality to rise. His title, formerly uttered by people with awe, was Atlas. Currently, he was barely more than a giant form sprawled over the dirt, his yellow fur faded to the hue of ancient dust. Tufts of his mane had dropped out, revealing marred skin carved with the chronicle of past wars. Insects buzzed around his back limb, where the meat had puffed hideously around a septic injury. The scent of rot hung on him acrid and distinct. Every inhalation rose shallow in his ribs, then drifted away as if even oxygen wished not to stay. Atlas did not raise his skull when the light climbed higher. He had discovered in recent days to hoard what tiny vigor survived. Motion required too much. Thought demanded even more. Starvation had receded into a remote pain, and dehydration had turned into a dull, persistent fire in his throat. His system had started the gradual, intentional act of shutting itself off. This location was not picked by chance. When the family forced him away, it occurred rapidly and without ritual. Junior males, thin and ferocious, had closed in from every angle. There was no loathing in their gazes, merely estimation. Atlas had sensed the initial strike rip into his back leg, felt the searing agony bloom and expand. He had bellowed then, a noise that once sent rivals fleeing. This time it reverberated futilely across the stones. The group did not kill him. They had no need to. They merely pivoted away. Atlas hobbled for hours, subsequently led by intuition, more ancient than recollection. He traveled west, away from hydration, away from the stalking grounds, away from anything that might attract notice. The frail did not perish in the heart of the globe. They located silent spots, neutral zones, areas where the finale could arrive without display. This stony ledge, situated on the border of the preserve, had appeared suitable. For 3 days, Atlas hardly stirred. Scavenger birds arrived initially as remote dots spiraling high where the atmosphere was chillier. By the 4th dawn, they sat nearer. Tolerant and bold, Atlas viewed them when he parted his lids. Their hairless pates cocked their black eyes, assessing. He did not growl. He did not stand. He merely observed them observing him. There was no terror remaining in him, only resignation. The wasteland vibrated gently around his dimming consciousness. Somewhere distant, a bird cried. Warmth emanated from the rock under his bones. His pulse decelerated, widening the gaps between every beat. Atlas shut his eyes once more, prepared to let the quiet claim him. That was the moment the noise arrived. Initially, it hardly registered. An erratic cadence borne on the breeze. Too crisp to be a storm, too desperate to pertain to the earth. Atlas's ears flicked despite himself, the motion tiny but innate. The audio came again, nearer now. A grinding, slipping sound, a respiration drawn too rapidly through human chests. Atlas's eyes parted to slender cracks. Down the incline, past the shattered brush and strewn rocks, something was traversing that did not fit. A silhouette tripped into sight, disturbing the dirt, his strides jagged and hopeless. Even from this span, Atlas could feel the incorrectness of it. The stranger's odor sliced through the arid atmosphere. Perspiration dread steel. Human. Atlas observed without curiosity. People had been a component of his realm for as long as he could recall. They arrived in vehicles, conversed in hushed tones, looked from behind fences. Some bore instruments that scorched and severed. Others carried nourishment hydration drugs. They were volatile, but none of that counted now. Whatever problem this male bore was not Atlas's affair. The figure collapsed. Atlas detected the collision before he viewed it plainly. A keen shriek quickly devoured by the breeze. The male clawed, attempting to stand, but flopped. His actions were feverish now, his palms burrowing futilely into sliding gravel. Then Atlas caught their scent. Hyenas. The audio reached him subsequently, the distinct chattering cackle, biting and vicious ricocheting between boulders. Forms appeared from behind the crest, low to the dirt, advancing with intent. They spread out instinctively, blocking exit paths with rehearsed skill. Atlas's stare tracked them with detached focus. He tallied without intending to. 4, 5. More still gliding into sight. The stranger pushed his spine against a rock torso, panting gaze frantic as he sought a path out that did not exist. One of the scavengers rushed ahead, probing, then bounded back, jaws clicking in thrill. The ring constricted. Atlas shut his lids. This was the order of nature. The wilderness took what was offered. Hunters concluded what frailty started. Atlas had embraced his position in that formula. He possessed no domain left, to guard no family, to shield no tomorrow, to battle for. His frame stayed motionless, weighted against the soil. Yet the noises did not cease. The human yelled one coarse, wordless note ripped from his ribs. The beasts replied with cackles that scraped against Atlas's senses. Deep within him, something altered. Not haste, not fright, something more ancient, something that sought no leave. Atlas's talons extended faintly in the dirt. He did not comprehend why his pulse started to hammer faster, why his sinews tightened against his desire. He only realized that the audio of that human cry, stretched, shattering, declined to vanish into the periphery like everything else. Atlas pulled in a respiration, profound and aching. The motion transmitted a bolt of misery through his septic limb, and for a second gloom encroached into the borders of his sight. He almost submitted to it. Almost. Then gradually, impossibly, Atlas transferred his bulk ahead. The rock grated under his front paws as he collected himself, hoisting his giant skull into the glow. Far beneath the pack hesitated their focus, snapping upward as a unit. The man halted too, his vision expanding as he tracked their stare. On the bluff above them, outlined against the cruel pale heavens, an aging, wounded lion commenced to rise. And somewhere between intuition and recollection, Atlas made his initial stride downward. Atlas's form descended the slope akin to the way a mountain migrates, sluggish, reluctant, yet impossible to disregard. Dirt slipped beneath his pads. Pebbles tumbled away in tiny avalanches. Each stride tugged at the destroyed flesh in his rear limb, shooting a vivid, chastising jolt along his neural pathways. Still, he advanced. Not swiftly, not elegantly. Merely forward, every footfall a resolution he was unaware he could still make. Beneath him, the hyenas hesitated, their cackles thinning into brittle, doubtful barks. They were accustomed to terror, accustomed to victims that crumbled, pleaded, and fled. They were unacquainted with a beast that appeared to have abandoned existence, yet elected to rise regardless. Atlas did not bare his fangs for supremacy. He did not hoist his tail in provocation. He merely climbed down, gaze locked and steady, as if a dormant force had stirred within him that disregarded consequences. Briefly, the sun hit his fur, exposing what the gloom had concealed, the dense web of marks across his spine and sides, pale seams woven into the pelt by time. His left ear was tattered, bitten ages ago. His mane, once dense and obsidian, had eroded into uneven clumps, leaving his throat bare like a weathered statue. The wilderness had attempted to obliterate him. It failed. In a prior existence, one that felt incredibly distant now, Atlas was the sort of creature humans murmured about. Not due to immense size or tricks or ownership. Atlas was renowned for something elusive, something unmeasurable, gravitas. The manner in which he stood, without flinching, how the atmosphere appeared to align around him, how other beasts yielded ground, even when feigning indifference. The sanctuary staff utilized different terms. They labeled him legendary, a symbol, the visage of the refuge. They recorded him at dawn and twilight lenses, capturing the gold in his mane, his silhouette framed against red stone and vast sky. Guests arrived and fell silent upon viewing him, as if noise was rude near something so ancient and sure. Atlas had spent most of his days here in the American Southwest, a site constructed to mimic the open plains he never truly knew. He arrived young, lanky, agitated, still learning to wield his might. His backstory was complex, cobbled together from documents and muttered chats between caretakers, imported, relocated, saved. Some claimed saved, though that term always suited the savior more than the saved. Atlas ignored human tales. He valued domain hydration, cover the placement of bodies, the hierarchy of the world. For years, he anchored the center of it. He memorized every contour of the terrain. The dry creek that filled after scarce rains, the cactus cluster shielding vermin, the fence corner that whistled in the east wind. He learned the schedule of human vehicles, when they brought meat, when they departed. He learned which humans moved softly and which carried attention in their hands. And he learned the other lions. The preserve tried to maintain balance, sufficient room, sufficient food, sufficient range to stop constant war. But felines remained felines. They drafted no peace treaties. They did not grow grateful with age. They lived by a code requiring no speech. The juvenile males arrived like seasons first, as remote pressure, then as an unavoidable storm. Atlas detected them months before they openly defied him. It started with prolonged stares, in the way they walked too near the water without averting their gaze, in the way they tested boundaries with squared shoulders and confident steps. Atlas replied, as he always had, by standing by, staring, by reminding them with silence alone that the center was his. For a while it worked. Then his leg failed him. It occurred on a mundane day, the type the desert possessed in endless supply, bright, arid, and unfeeling. Atlas rose from the shade to drink, and a younger male blocked his path. Atlas pivoted as quickly as ever, but the earth shifted beneath a loose layer of stone. His hind foot slid. Agony flared hot and instant. Not a dramatic fracture, not a bone snapping, as humans imagined in stories, just a tearing internal pull that altered everything. He concealed it initially. Pride required it. Instinct required it. Atlas moved slower, but he moved. He rested more, but rose when necessary. He refused to show frailty. But lions sense frailty the way smoke detects fire. The younger males began to press harder. They didn't rush into a direct clash. Not at first. They waited for him to lag on open ground. They circled wider when he drank. They forced him to turn too fast repeatedly until pain became visible in his stiff posture. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the rock, it finally happened. Atlas was near the ridge when they arrived. Two young males, coats, gleaming eyes bright with the arrogance of bodies that had not yet learned limits. They did not announce themselves with a warning roar. They closed the distance quietly, shoulders loose, as if this were simply nature's next step. Atlas rose to meet them. The first collision wasn't cinematic. It was heavy and fast fur and muscle dust bursting upward. Atlas struck hard, still capable of violence, still capable of command. But when he tried to shift weight to pivot for the second blow, his injured leg buckled. It was only a fraction of a second. That was all it took. The rival lunged toward his rear and caught flesh where Atlas could not protect himself. Pain split bright behind Atlas's eyes. He roared, then a sound that rolled across the rocks and jolted birds from perches. Keepers later said they heard it from a mile away. But no one arrived in time to stop the law from doing what the law always did. The younger males didn't have to win through brute force. They only had to prove Atlas could no longer hold the center. When it ended, Atlas was still alive, still breathing, still upright. But the land had shifted. That night, Atlas stood alone by a patch of shade, blood drying dark on his fur, while the others moved deeper in, closer to water, closer to food, closer to the heart of the territory that was once his. In the days following, the staff tried to intervene. They watched from afar. They debated. They prepped tranquilizers and gear and discussed protocol. But protocol was built for humans, not for the slow, brutal truth of animals deciding their own rank. Atlas did not go to the feed station when he sensed others. He waited, letting hunger dig deep before risking proximity. He drank less to avoid crossing open ground. His leg swelled, the injury turning angry in the heat. Flies found the wound. Infection settled in quietly, like a thief in an empty house. The others watched him with patience that looked almost like mercy. Then one morning, Atlas realized he had become something worse than defeated. He had become tolerated. He saw it in the way the young males didn't bother chasing him, in the way they simply ignored him, confident. He would remove himself in the way the females kept their distance, eyes flicking away as if looking too long might invite bad luck. Atlas understood then what the desert had been trying to teach him. In this world, you didn't need to be killed to be gone. Sometimes you were erased while still breathing. That was the moment he left. No roar, no final stand, no dramatic exit. Atlas simply turned west and walked. He crossed dry washes, stumbled over low rock, paused under sparse trees with paper-thin leaves. He moved mostly at night, when the air cooled, and pain dulled into something tolerable. When dawn came, he found shade and lay still, letting hours pass over him. His body grew thinner, his breath shorter, his leg worse, and still he walked. Because somewhere inside, the last piece of dignity insisted that if he was going to die, he would do it beyond the pride's gaze, beyond the cameras, beyond the human stories of a peaceful passing. Peaceful was a word Atlas never trusted. He wanted quiet. He wanted distance. He wanted an ending that belonged to him. So he chose this hill, this outcrop, this thin slice of shade in a world made of heat. And he lay down ready for the slow fade. Until now, until the broken, desperate sounds below had pulled him back from the brink like a hook in the dark. Atlas continued his downward climb, each footfall, dislodging grit from the rocks. His gaze constricted, focusing solely on motion and danger. He was faintly conscious of the man still flattened against a large boulder chest, heaving rapidly, eyes stretched in disbelief. The stranger's face was smeared with grime and perspiration. His attire resembled outdoor gear ripped at the knee, the sort of material built to withstand thicket and stone. One boot rested at a skewed angle, implying agony. But the man's focus was not on himself. It was on Atlas, on this improbable shape marching down into the heart of peril. The human's lips stirred, forming terms Atlas could not comprehend. Not boisterous, not authoritative, but gentler, fractured by dread and wonder. Hey, big guy, don't. Atlas did not approach the person for solace. He approached to position himself between the man and the ring of fangs constricting beneath them. Upon reaching the lower incline, the scavengers dispersed once more, seeking an angle that would exact the lowest price. Their eyes were luminous and schematic bodies slung low. They sampled the breeze with their snouts. They scented Atlas now, not vigor, not adolescence, but a complex aroma. Ancient blood sepsis fatigue, yet undeniably lion. Atlas halted. The stillness resembled the split second preceding a thunderbolt. His ribs expanded, his larynx constricted around a noise that ought to have deserted him. It emerged regardless, coarse, flawed, abraded by dehydration and years. Not a roar intended to conquer a realm, but a roar intended to draw a boundary. And as the hyenas recoiled at the audio, the man behind Atlas gulped, hands trembling around the futile branch he held, for he could perceive it now, lucid as day. This beast was not advancing to claim him. This beast was advancing to guard him. For the first time since the hunt started, the man's eyes brimmed with something beyond mere terror. It was the bewildered, stinging query of one witnessing a marvel materialize in the dirt. "Why?" he whispered, the syllable ripped from him like a plea. The query hung suspended in the atmosphere without reply as Atlas maintained his stance. Past the lion's giant bulk, the man observed the hyenas adjusting, re-evaluating. Their assurance had fractured, not shattered, but fissured enough to allow doubt to leak in. It purchased time, not security, merely time. And time, the man realized, was a currency that could be spent poorly or astutely. His name was Daniel Carter, and reclining against the stone with his ankle shrieking in protest, he tasted the well-known acrid flavor of his own errors. He had promised himself he would be swift. He always did. A brief sweep along the gorge, a check for traps or tire treads, then return to the vehicle before the warmth became merciless. That was the scheme. Plans, however, possessed a habit of disintegrating the instant the terrain decreed otherwise. Daniel clenched his jaw and adjusted his mass. White-hot torment shot up his limb, compelling a breath from him in a low hiss. Definitely a severe sprain, potentially worse. He shoved the evaluation aside. Medical aid came later, if there was a later. He kept his eyes on the hyenas, tracking their motion the way training had instructed him long before he stepped foot in this wasteland. Count range geometry. They weren't starving, not frantic enough to dash blindly. That rendered them hazardous. Intelligent hunters awaited frailty the way physicians awaited symptoms. Daniel swallowed and willed himself to respire slower. The feline did not budge. That was the oddest detail. Daniel was raised among wildlife. Not the idealized version found online, but the genuine article. Creatures that snapped when trapped, creatures that bolted when able, creatures that slew because it was the easiest solution. He had labored alongside rangers, vets, conservation agents. He had learned occasionally painfully what to anticipate when humans crossed paths with beings that owed them no pity. An injured lion electing to interpose himself between a human and a pack of hyenas was not on that roster. Daniel glanced up at Atlas's flank, near enough now to view the tremor coursing through the old animal's sinews. The lion's respiration was arduous, each lift of his ribs erratic. Dark liquid oozed from the rear leg, dripping into the soil and painting it a richer hue of reddish-brown. This was not a calculated display of supremacy. This was not domain defense. This was something distinct. "Easy," Daniel murmured without thinking, his voice hushed and steady the way he'd spoken to wounded troops years ago when panic threatened to claim them before blood loss did. "Easy, I'm not going anywhere." He wasn't addressing the lion. Not truly. He was addressing himself. One of the hyenas crept nearer, probing the perimeter. Its ears were aloft, gaze locked on the lion's back leg. Daniel felt his gut constrict. He shifted again, gripping the stick tighter, hoisting it, as if the slender wood could effect a change. Atlas responded before Daniel could yell. The lion's head turned sluggish but intentional, and he released another sound deeper than prior, not a roar this time, but a caution that vibrated through his thorax and carried straight into the marrow of those who heard it. The hyena froze, body taut, then eased back a pace, reassessing. Daniel stared. He had witnessed lions charge. He had witnessed them retreat. He had never seen one hold a line like this while already halfway to the tomb. A memory flickered through Daniel's mind, one he hadn't touched in ages. A different desert, different heat, the scent of antiseptic and iron instead of dust and sagebrush. He pushed it down. Now wasn't the moment. Focus. Daniel reached slowly toward the radio clipped to his vest. His movements measured. The device was fractured. The antenna bent at an ugly angle from his tumble, but he thumbed the switch regardless. "Carter to base," he stated, keeping his voice as serene as he could. "I've got a situation. Injured. Coordinates." The radio hissed, then went silent. Daniel exhaled through his nose, fighting the urge to chuckle, of course. He tucked the radio back. No rescue was arriving soon. Whatever transpired next would unfold here between teeth and dust, and the impossible presence of an old lion who refused to depart. The hyenas shifted again, fanning wider now. They were patient. They would wait for the lion to buckle. They could smell weakness as clearly as Daniel could smell his own perspiration. Atlas ventured one pace ahead. The motion taxed him. Daniel could spot it the way the lion's rear limb wavered, the slight lurch, as he adjusted, transferring mass to his shoulders. Atlas was not charging to strike. He was eliminating distance, fortifying the barrier he established between Daniel and the clan. "Don't." Daniel whispered the word thick in his throat. "You don't have to do this." The lion did not look back at him. Daniel felt something fracture inside his chest. Not fear, not yet. Awe edged with guilt. He had come here to shield animals from harm. He had come here to prevent suffering where he could. And now one of them was spending the residue of his life for a stranger who hadn't earned it. The pack acted simultaneously, not a total assault but a synchronized shove. Two dashed left, one right, attempting to divide Atlas's focus. Daniel's heart rate surged. He forced himself upright on his valid leg, leaning heavily on the stone, hoisting the stick. Atlas responded with a velocity that seemed like a fabrication. His skull whipped left jaws, separating just enough to display teeth tarnished by age and gore. He lunged, not far, not swift, but sufficient. The nearest hyena skidded to a halt, startled by the suddenness of it. Another circled wider, laughing again, the sound sharper, now emboldened. Daniel yelled, then the noise tearing loose before he could check it. He brandished the wood, striking rock, creating clamor, anything to contribute to the disarray. The hyenas paused, darting glances between the man and the beast, computing once more. Time stretched thin. Atlas's breathing worsened. Daniel could hear it now, the rasp in the lion's lungs, the wet audio of effort. This couldn't endure. Daniel knew it the way he knew when a patient was crashing. Before the monitor screamed, before the body surrendered, he searched the ground with his eyes, seeking anything. Rocks, branches, something heavier than a stick. His gaze caught on Atlas's shadow, instead long and distorted, across the sand. For a moment, the shadow looked larger than the lion himself, as if it carried all the years Atlas had walked this land. "Why are you still standing?" Daniel whispered again. "Quieter now." Another memory pressed forward, uninvited this time. Younger hands' clumsy stitches, a heartbeat fluttering beneath his fingers that shouldn't have been there but was. He shook his head hard, forcing the image away. Not now, later. A sudden bark from the hyenas snapped him back. They were closing in again, more aggressive this time. The calculation had shifted. Risk was rising, but so was opportunity. Atlas swayed his strength, bleeding out into the sand. Daniel's chest tightened with something close to panic. He did the only thing he could think of. He stepped forward. Pain exploded through his ankle, nearly dropping him, but he stayed upright, planting himself closer to Atlas's flank. He raised the stick and shouted, his voice cracking but loud, raw, human. "Hey!" The sound echoed off the rocks. One hyena flinched, another snarled, turning its attention toward Daniel for the first time. Atlas felt it. The lion pivoted slightly, angling his body so that his shoulder blocked the hyena's line of sight to the man. The movement was small, protective, unmistakable. Daniel's breath caught. The message was clear. "Stay behind me." And somehow, impossibly, Daniel obeyed. The hyenas faltered again, caught between two threats, neither of which made sense. The lion, old, injured, refusing to fall. The man, loud, upright, reckless enough to step closer instead of run. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then, as suddenly as they had advanced, the hyenas began to pull back, not fleeing, but retreating. Their laughter faded into frustrated clicks as they melted into the rocks, gazes never quitting the pair they had concluded were, for the moment, not worth the expense. Silence rushed in to fill the space they left behind. Daniel sagged against the rock, breath shuddering. He lowered the stick, his hands shaking violently now that the immediate danger had passed. He looked at Atlas. He really looked at him up close. The lion's legs trembled. His head dipped, then lifted again through sheer force of will. Dark blood stained the fur around his wound. The desert wind brushed his mane, thin and uneven, lifting it like a tattered banner. "Thank you," Daniel said hoarsely. "I don't know why you did that, but thank you." Atlas stood for another heartbeat. Then his legs folded. The massive body sank into the dust with a sound that felt final, the kind of sound that made Daniel's stomach drop. He lurched ahead instinctively, kneeling beside the lion, despite the agony, one hand hovering unsure before resting softly against the rough pelt at Atlas's neck. The beast's hide was scorching beneath his palm, excessively so. Atlas's eyes were parted, vacant, locked on something past the skyline. Daniel leaned nearer, his voice sinking to a murmur intended for one being alone in a vast, indifferent realm. "Stay with me," he urged. "Just stay." And as the wilderness held its breath, Daniel did not yet grasp that the reason Atlas had risen was already stirring, ancient, interred, and about to emerge. Atlas did not reply. He couldn't. His respiration came in jagged drags, as if his lungs had lost the cadence of life. Daniel kept his hand on the lion's throat, sensing heat emanate through fur, feeling the faint shudder running through the old frame like a remote engine attempting to crank. The desert provided no solace, only the dull friction of wind over stone and the relentless burden of the sun. Somewhere far off, a bird cried once and then fell mute, as if even it knew to avoid what was transpiring here. Daniel's mind raced the way it always did when terror threatened to paralyze him. He surveyed Atlas's leg, the bloating, the dark sleekness around the injury, the subtle trembling that implied nerves firing in objection. Sepsis, fever, trauma. The lion had expended his final vigor on the wrong moment on Daniel. "That's it," Daniel whispered, more to himself than to Atlas. Okay, we're going to do this the hard way." He glanced about. The gorge sliced the terrain into crude, sharp angles. Sparse mesquite provided meager shade that did nothing against the warmth. The nearest route was miles away. His truck sat even farther down the wash where he'd abandoned it to evade detection. Because the task he'd been performing out here wasn't one the wrong crowds needed to spot. Daniel's gaze landed on his fractured radio again. He hoisted it, thumbed the switch, shook it like fury might revive a signal. 0. He exhaled and willed his breathing to decelerate. He could still maneuver. One ankle was damaged but not futile. He possessed water, half a flask. A tiny medkit built for people, not lions. And he held one asset he hadn't anticipated: time purchased by a beast who had already been prepared to perish. Daniel leaned close to Atlas's ear, speaking gently, as if the pitch mattered. "I'm going to fetch aid," he stated. "I don't know the duration, but I'm returning. You hear me? Don't you dare. Don't you dare depart before I do." He didn't know why he voiced it like a decree, like a vow sworn under oath. Perhaps because his existence had drilled him to speak that way when the earth felt shaky. Perhaps because some fragment of him felt Atlas had merited the right to be addressed with reverence. Daniel shifted his mass to rise and nearly crumbled when his ankle shrieked again. He ground his teeth and braced himself against the rock, then looked back down at Atlas. The lion's lids had drifted half shut. His form had gone limp. That scared Daniel more than the hyenas had. Hunters were foreseeable. The gradual fading of a living entity wasn't. "Hey," Daniel said louder. "Atlas, stay with me." The name escaped his lips before he could query it. Atlas. Daniel had never encountered this lion before. Not officially, not in any manner that should have made a name surface on impulse. And yet there it was, sitting between them like a weird third entity. Daniel stared at Atlas's visage, at the heavy brow, at the old marks across the snout. A surge of confusion swept over him, keen and abrupt. Where had that name originated? He felt the fringes of a memory graze his mind, as fleeting as a phantom. A younger version of himself, late teens, maybe 20, standing under neon tubes, hands and gloves too large, heart-thumping, with the first true duty of his life. A steel table, a crate, the audio of something respiring too rapidly. Daniel blinked hard. The wasteland snapped back into clarity. Not now, he told himself. Not now. He reached for his phone, dead hot and worthless. He retrieved a small flare from his crisis pack and weighed it, then set it down. A flare would signal the wrong folks exactly where he was, and out here, the wrong folks weren't just outlaws. They were the sort of men who didn't mind abandoning a biologist in the desert if it kept their operations silent. Daniel's gut knotted. He had come out here trailing signs of illicit action, bait heaps that didn't belong. A boot print pattern too distinct to be from trekkers. Tire treads that veered off the service track in the middle of nowhere. Someone had been exploiting this zone. Someone who knew it well. The hyenas weren't the sole peril. Daniel looked at Atlas again. Leaving him solo felt like treason. But remaining without aid meant both would be finished. Daniel ripped open the small med kit with trembling fingers and withdrew what he could utilize: gauze, a spool of tape, antiseptic pads, a tiny vial of saline. Human gear laughably scant. Still, it was something. He poured a lid of water into his palm and pressed it to Atlas's muzzle, letting a few droplets slide between chapped lips. Atlas's tongue stirred faintly, as if reflex still resided in him. Daniel swallowed hard. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." He bound gauze around his own bleeding knuckles, scraped from clawing on rocks, and then paused, observing Atlas's injury. He couldn't cleanse it properly. He couldn't suture it. He couldn't even safely get close enough without risking a defensive snap from a beast who might wake frantic. But Atlas wasn't frantic. Atlas was vanishing. Daniel took the smallest gamble anyway. He tore open a sterile wipe, wrinkled his nose at the biting scent, and dabbed softly at the rim of the swelling. Not deep, not near raw meat, just enough to lessen surface filth. Atlas didn't recoil. His eyes parted briefly hazy, then drifted again. Daniel's throat constricted. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know this isn't adequate." He looked toward the distant crest, scanning the rim, as if help might simply materialize. Nothing, only heat stone and the long, brilliant void of the American Southwest. Then Daniel heard it, not laughter this time. Steps, a faint crunch, the distinct noise of something heavy traversing rock. Daniel froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed the stick again, futile as it was, and pushed himself upright, planting his body between Atlas and the direction of the noise. A figure emerged on the ridgeline. Daniel's breath hitched. For a split second, hope sparked. Maybe a warden, maybe a trekker, but the outline was wrong. Too still, too intentional. The person wore a cap pulled low and bore something long slung over one shoulder. A rifle. Daniel's mouth went arid. The man on the ridge didn't hurry. He watched, evaluating the scene below. The wounded man, the lion, collapsed in the dust, the faint dark smears in the sand. Then the figure turned his head slightly, as if hearkening for something like someone else nearby. Daniel's pulse hammered. This was precisely what he'd dreaded. The people working this sector weren't novices. They moved like predators. The man began to descend. Daniel's mind sprinted. If he fled, he'd be snagged. If he stayed, he'd be cornered. His only edge was that this stranger didn't yet know what Daniel knew, that he was a wildlife biologist with proof, and that the lion in the dust wasn't just a dying beast. In the wrong grip, Atlas would become a prize, a tale told over liquor, a private photo circulated by men who labeled cruelty tradition. Daniel's fingers tightened around the stick until his knuckles throbbed. The stranger reached the lower slope and halted at a range, eyes sweeping over Daniel with clinical curiosity. Daniel could see his face now. Bronzed skin, a trim beard, eyes concealed behind shades. "You lost," the man called. His voice held an easy acquaintance that didn't suit the firearm. Daniel forced himself to keep his pitch level. "I'm hurt," he said. I require aid." The man's stare slid past him to Atlas. The pause was subtle, but Daniel caught it. The slight rise of intrigue, the math behind the stillness. "That's a big cat," the man said. Daniel gulped. "He's injured." "No kidding." The man adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder, still not sighting it, still not acting openly hostile. "You out here solo?" Daniel felt sweat trickle down his spine. "Yeah." The man nodded slowly, as if that verified something. "Plenty of folks don't come out here solo," he said. "Not these days." Daniel made himself hold eye contact even though the shades gave him nothing back. "I didn't have a choice." The man's lips curved into a grin that didn't reach his cheeks. "You always got a choice." Daniel cycled through his alternatives. He could negotiate. He could delay. He could ensure this man remained fixated on him rather than Atlas. If he could convince the intruder that Daniel held no worth, perhaps the man would depart. Yet Daniel's vest, his equipment, his bearing, everything stamped him as a man with an objective. The stranger advanced, and in that instant, when Daniel sensed the snare tightening from an unforeseen angle, Atlas stirred. It was not theatrical. It wasn't the abrupt surge from earlier. It was a subtle adjustment, the hoisting of a massive skull, the slight roll of shoulders as if the lion's frame was attempting to recall how to protect something. Atlas's lids parted, his eyes fixed hazy at first, then honing in on the new arrival. A guttural rumble emanated from his throat, more tremor than vocalization. The stranger paused, taken aback despite himself. Daniel felt his breath catch. Atlas was barely conscious, barely existing. Yet the impulse to interpose himself between the peril and the human behind him remained intact. The stranger emitted a short chuckle. "That beast has spirit." Daniel's voice emerged coarse. "Let him be." The man cocked his head. "Why is he your property?" Daniel nearly denied it. He nearly spoke what logic dictated, that the feline was not his, that he was merely a victim of circumstance. But the denial died in his throat, because in the preceding minutes, Atlas had transformed into something exceeding a random animal Daniel had stumbled upon. He had become a debt. Daniel's gaze darted back to the lion's marred shoulder, and that semi-buried recollection pressed more urgently this time. The harsh glare of artificial tubes, a transport cage, the hot, frightened respiration of a cub against his palm. A name scrawled on a clipboard in black ink. Atlas. Daniel's chest constricted, not with dread now, but with a dawning, impossible realization that felt as though the desert floor had lurched beneath him. The stranger took another pace forward, and Atlas, shivering violently, began to gather his limbs beneath him once more, sluggishly, agonizingly, as if he would rise one final time, even if it meant crumbling the instant after. Daniel's voice cracked not from frailty, but from desperation. "Don't," he urged the stranger. "Just don't." The intruder's fingers drifted casually, almost lethargically, toward the rifle sling, as if debating whether the day's agenda required one more bullet. Daniel remained rooted. He had no other option. His ankle pulsed like a second heart, and the atmosphere between them felt brittle, poised to snap. He brandished the futile branch before him, not as a weapon, but as a declaration that he would not yield silently. Atlas shifted again at his side. The lion's legs quivered so intensely that the vibration traveled through his shoulders and into the dirt, jarring loose pebbles. His head rose a few inches higher, just enough for his eyes to lock onto the armed man. Something resided in that stare, something ancient and undiluted. Not fury, not supremacy, a warning that required no physical might to be comprehended. The stranger hesitated behind his dark lenses. His focus flicked from Daniel to Atlas, then to the earth where dark blotches stained the sand. He did not advance now. He stood there, the firearm still shouldered, body angled, as if he might depart instantly, or commit to an act he would rue later. Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his throat. He willed his voice to remain firm. "This is a conservation zone," he stated. "You aren't authorized to be here." The stranger's lips curled, amused. "And you are?" Daniel did not reply with his title. He didn't say biologist or field investigator or anything sounding bureaucratic. Bureaucracy meant documents. Documents meant complications. Complications meant the sort of men who didn't mind interment of evidence in the wasteland. "I'm wounded," Daniel said instead. "And he is wounded. That is all you need to grasp." The stranger took a slow sidestep, widening his arc around Atlas. Daniel pivoted too, mirroring him, keeping the lion behind his frame as best he could. It was absurd, like a man attempting to shield a monolith from a tempest, yet instinct compelled Daniel to try. Then, from somewhere beyond the stones, the wilderness altered its intent again. A noise swept in, low and biting, a clicking laughter, a chorus of hungry certainty returning to collect what it believed was still due. Hyenas. Daniel's stomach plummeted. He turned his head just enough to sweep the ridge. Motion. Multiple forms, low and swift, pouring between boulders like liquid. The stranger's posture rigidified. He heard them too. For the first time, his composure seemed to fracture. He glanced toward the clamor, then back to Daniel, then back to Atlas. Rapid arithmetic flashed across his face. A rifle could resolve specific issues, but a pack of hyenas didn't behave like paper targets, and the desert had a knack for turning arrogance into a liability. "Your friends?" the stranger asked, his tone sharper now. Daniel nearly laughed at the preposterousness. No, the scavengers came into view more than previously. Or perhaps Daniel's terror made it appear as if the land itself was spawning teeth. They spread across the lower incline, wary now, emboldened by the passage of time and the scent of blood. They had smelled Atlas's frailty. They had smelled Daniel's perspiration. They had waited long enough to conclude the prize might finally justify the cost. The stranger took a step backward without realizing it. His hand clenched the rifle strap. Atlas's breathing turned jagged. Daniel could hear a faint rasp in the lion's throat like parchment tearing. But Atlas didn't retreat. He didn't crumble. Instead, impossibly, he hoisted himself up. His forelegs locked, his shoulders squared, his rear leg dragged, refusing to bear full weight. But Atlas managed to stand on 3 points of obstinacy. The hyenas paused. They recalled the line he'd drawn earlier. But memory was not identical to fear. Starvation could revise even the clearest lesson. One hyena crept ahead, then another. They didn't rush. They conserved energy. They moved like hunters who understood that patience was an arsenal. Daniel's mind sprinted. He faced 3 threats now: hyenas, heat, and an armed man who could become anything, depending on how this next minute unraveled. Daniel could feel his ankle bloating inside his boot. He could feel the canteen sloshing with far too little fluid. He could feel the lion beside him radiating fever. And still Atlas stood. The stranger watched, unnerved. "That cat is going to get himself killed," he muttered, as if lodging a grievance. Daniel's eyes remained on the hyenas. "He already decided." Daniel said the words escaping him without leave. "He made that choice a while ago." The stranger's head jerked slightly toward Daniel, as though detecting something in his tone that clashed with the scenario, something resembling devotion, something resembling guilt. Then the hyenas mobilized once more. 2 broke left, attempting to fracture Atlas's focus. One darted toward the rear, angling for the crippled limb. Another loitered eyes on Daniel, reading him as the softer mark. Daniel hoisted his branch, yelled, and smashed it against stone. The noise rang hard and brilliant, reverberating down the gully. Atlas replied with a rumble that vibrated the air. The hyena nearest his back leg faltered, then sprang anyway, swift and frantic, lured by the promise of frailty. Atlas moved like a beast, rejecting the arithmetic. His paw swept out, not a theatrical swing, not a flashy blow, just a savage, efficient motion that compelled the hyena to veer off and skid in the grit. The scavenger yelped, more startled than injured, and recoiled, shaking its head as if it couldn't fathom an old lion retaining that much vigor. But the exertion taxed Atlas. His frame swayed, his hind leg buckled a fraction. Daniel witnessed it and felt dread clamp down on him. The hyenas saw it too, ears pricked, mouths parting in that ghastly laughing thrill. The pack constricted its ring, not fully closing, just enough to make every inhalation feel like a countdown. Time elongated. Minutes elapsed with no definitive assault, only pressure. The hyenas prowled, circling wide, forcing Atlas to pivot repeatedly. Each slow rotation tugged at the septic wound. Each pivot siphoned strength. They were eroding him, letting the wilderness perform half the labor. Daniel grasped the tactic with frigid clarity. Fatigue wasn't dramatic. It was simply unavoidable. He scoured the ground again, this time for something heftier, something he could hurl. His fingers located a flat rock near his knee. He seized it and flung it with all his might toward the closest hyena. The stone clattered off another rock, missing the mark, but the clamor made the beast flinch back. Daniel grabbed another stone, then another. He threw until his shoulders seared. It didn't matter if he connected. It mattered that he disrupted their cadence. Atlas's respiration grew harsher. His thorax expanded and contracted like bellows on their final cycle. Sweat, yes, sweat, even on a lion, darkened patches of fur near his mane. Fever and exertion were devouring him from the inside. Daniel's voice went hoarse from shouting. He realized he was screaming at the hyenas like a man attempting to banish nightmares. "Back! Get back!" One hyena angled toward him, eyes luminous, probing. Daniel raised the stick and swung. The beast hopped back, laughed, then edged in again. And then Atlas did something Daniel couldn't elucidate. The lion shifted his weight forward, not away from the pack, but toward them. He stepped in a racing distance, forcing the group to yield ground by a single yard. His posture wasn't confident. It was desperate. But it worked. The hyenas recoiled, unnerved by his refusal to play the role they anticipated. The stranger with the rifle had moved further up the incline, maintaining his distance now. Daniel noticed him only in fragments, boots scraping a whisper of motion, the silhouette of the weapon against the sky. The man wasn't assisting. He wasn't departing either. He looked like someone observing a tempest, waiting to see which way the wind would turn. Daniel loathed him for that. But the desert didn't permit Daniel the luxury of loathing. It demanded action. The hyenas surged again. This time they came in closer, faster, trying to overwhelm Atlas's focus. One snapped at his tail, another darted toward his hind leg. A third feinted at his front, compelling him to choose. Atlas tried to turn. Agony tore through him. His injured leg dragged, his equilibrium slipped. The lion dropped to one knee, caught himself, then dropped again. Dust erupted around his body as he fought to remain upright. Daniel's heart lurched. "No, no, no." He whispered the words barely audible. Atlas's eyes flicked toward Daniel for the first time. It wasn't a look of solicitation. It wasn't a plea. It was a look that said, "Stay behind me." And that gaze, so steady, so deliberate, unraveled Daniel in a way he wasn't prepared for. The hyenas closed in another step. Daniel's mind flashed back to other moments like this, moments he'd sworn never to relive. A different landscape, a different kind of screaming. His hands pressing down on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. His voice ordering someone to stay awake. His heart learning that sometimes you didn't win. You only delayed losing long enough to give someone else a chance. Daniel felt that same old metallic taste rise in his mouth. He couldn't let Atlas do this alone. Daniel forced his injured ankle to bear weight again. He rose trembling and stepped to Atlas's side shoulder, nearly level with the lion's rib cage. He lifted the stick high and slammed it against rock again, the sharp crack echoing down the ravine. "Come on!" Daniel shouted, wild now. "Come on!" The nearest hyena flinched. Another hyena boulder lunged toward Daniel's legs. Daniel swung the stick and struck the ground hard in front of it. The beast skidded back, startled, then snarled, then circled wider, searching for an opening. Atlas's head dipped, and another low rumble rolled out of him, deep and vibrating. The sound wasn't potent, but it was enough to remind the pack that the lion still possessed teeth and claws, even if the rest of him was failing. The tension held barely. The sun began to tilt, sliding toward late afternoon. Shadows stretched longer across the rocks. The air cooled by a degree so small it would have been meaningless to most creatures. But out here, even small changes mattered. The pack seemed to sense it too. Their pacing grew more urgent. They didn't want this to turn into a prolonged contest with night approaching. The stranger up the slope shifted again, uneasy. A sharp, distant noise carried on the wind, an engine far away maybe. Or maybe it was nothing. Out here, sound traveled strangely, and hope could disguise itself as almost anything. The hyenas heard it. They paused, ears swiveling, bodies tensed. They looked briefly toward the horizon, then back to Atlas and Daniel, as if weighing whether the desert was about to introduce a new complication. The matriarch Daniel could tell which one she was by the way the others watched her, issued a short, sharp bark. The pack hesitated. Then, with an irritation that sounded like laughter turning sour, they began to withdraw. Not running, but retreating, backing away slowly, refusing to offer the dignity of fear. They moved off between boulders, glancing back again and again, as if promising this wasn't finished, as if claiming they would remember the cost. Daniel's legs nearly gave out with relief. He turned toward Atlas, ready to speak, and saw the lion's body finally surrender. Atlas's front legs folded first, as if the joints had simply decided they'd done enough. His shoulders sank. His hindquarters followed, sliding into the dust with heavy finality. The lion didn't crash. He collapsed the way something ancient settles back into the earth. Daniel dropped to his knees beside him without thinking, pain and all. He placed his hand on Atlas's neck, again feeling the heat, the tremor, the ragged pulse that was still there, still fighting, still stubborn. "Hey," Daniel said, voice breaking now that the danger had passed. "Hey, stay with me, please." Atlas's eyelids fluttered. His gaze drifted unfocused, as if he were staring through Daniel instead of at him, into some distance deeper than the horizon. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper only the lion might hear. "I'm going to get you out of this," he said. "I swear I am." And as the last echoes of hyena laughter dissolved into the rocks, the stranger with the rifle remained up the slope, silent and watching, while Daniel stayed kneeling in the dust, guarding a lion who had already guarded him. The stranger remained on the incline, static, as if he had merged with the terrain. Just another boulder, another shadow, another menace. The wasteland offered no answers. Daniel kept his palm against Atlas's throat and tried to disregard the way the lion's pulse fluttered, erratic and feverish. He could sense the infection in the beast's hide, an unnatural warmth that had no place in the open breeze. Atlas's eyes were half shut now, glazed, focused on emptiness. The wind drifted through the sparse mane at his neck, lifting it softly, as if the earth were trying to coax him into surrender. Daniel's throat constricted. For years he'd drilled himself not to beg, not for pity, not for time, not for anything the cosmos had never guaranteed. But kneeling in the grit beside this lion, Daniel heard himself imploring. Anyway, his voice hushed and frantic. "Come on," he murmured. "Not like this." He glanced up at the stranger again. The man with the firearm had shifted his stance, restless, now his composure pierced by the hyena's withdrawal and the way the scenario refused to simplify. He didn't look like someone who savored complexities. Daniel's mind grasped for solutions with frigid, clinical velocity. If he stood, the agony in his ankle would fell him. If he lingered, the stranger might deem him a liability. If he attempted to crawl toward the ridge for better reception, he'd leave Atlas vulnerable. Every choice concluded with a loss. Then the desert presented something Daniel hadn't anticipated. A faint audio drifted on the wind. Engine hum far off, thin as a rumor. Daniel froze, straining to hear. It came again, clearer now, then vanished as the topography swallowed it. A vehicle somewhere on the service track. Perhaps a ranger patrol. Perhaps the wrong truck. The stranger heard it too. He turned his head, angling his ear toward the skyline, and for the first time his posture wasn't nonchalant. It was vigilant. That was Daniel's opening, small, brittle, but genuine. He reached into his pack with trembling fingers and withdrew the emergency flare again. His thumb hovered over the lid. A flare was a scream to the heavens. It was also an admission, I am here. The stranger's chin lifted slightly, as if sensing what Daniel was weighing. Don't, the man barked, voice suddenly sharper. You ignite that you'll summon everything out here. Daniel didn't reply. He couldn't not, without revealing how desperately he needed everything to arrive. Instead, he did something quieter. He reached for his canteen, took the smallest sip he could tolerate, and then leaned close to Atlas again. He lowered his voice into something steadier, something tender, like he was addressing a scared creature in a clinic rather than an aging lion dying under the sun. It's okay, Daniel said. You aren't alone. The words hit him like a spark. Not the phrase itself, he'd spoken variations of it to people and animals and himself for most of his adult life. It was the way it sat in his mouth, familiar in a profound sense, the rhythm, the soft dip at the end. A memory flickered at the periphery of his thoughts again, sharper this time, and Daniel's chest tightened as if a fist had closed around his ribs. Fluorescent tubes, a steel table, a crate with slats, a noise breathing too fast, too young, too wild to be caged. Daniel blinked hard. Atlas's eyelids fluttered. It was subtle, but Daniel caught it. The lion's ear twitched toward his voice, not away toward it, as if the sound had reached a place inside him that pain hadn't fully conquered. Daniel's throat went arid. He tried again, slower. Hey, he murmured. Hey, big guy. The stranger made an irritated sound up the slope. You chatting to it like it's a hound. Daniel ignored him because something was transpiring. Atlas's breathing hitched. One shallow drag, then another. His gaze shifted, unfocused but seeking. The lion's pupils narrowed slightly, not in aggression, but in concentration, like an animal attempting to identify something through a fog. Daniel swallowed, and without thinking, without even knowing why he did the thing, his body recalled before his brain could intercede. He whistled. 3 notes, then a drop, a simple little motif, the kind of tune someone might hum absent-mindedly while wiping a counter or walking down a corridor. It wasn't a song. It wasn't theatrical. It was just a noise. And the instant it left his lips, Daniel felt the past surge forward like a wave that had been waiting 20 years for the right tide. He saw himself at 19, sunburned and keen, wearing a volunteer ID at a wildlife rescue center outside Tucson. He'd been a kid then, too confident, too eager to prove he belonged in a world that dealt with claws and teeth and the quiet misery humans manufactured. He remembered the call that came in late one night. We've got a juvenile lion from a private roadside show, dehydrated, injured, not in good shape. He remembered the smell when the crate arrived, dust, urine, dread. He remembered the way the animal hurled itself against the slats, a blur of gold and panic. He remembered the first time he saw the lion's eyes wide, furious, petrified. He remembered the clipboard, Atlas. The name had been scrawled in thick black marker, all caps, the way people wrote when they wanted to feign certainty. Daniel recalled how absurd he'd felt standing there with gloves too large for his hands. He remembered the senior vet, Dr. Hensley, saying, "He's not your Project Carter, he's a patient. Respect the distinction." Daniel remembered the first time the lion stopped thrashing long enough to respire. It happened because Daniel had done what he always did when he didn't know what else to do. He whistled that same 3-note pattern, not to calm the lion like a trick, not to tame him, just to give the air something steady to hold. Something that wasn't shouting, wasn't metal, wasn't fear. The lion had quieted. Not fully, not magically, but enough. Enough for the sedative to take hold. Enough for them to treat the deep gash on the shoulder, where chain and neglect had carved into flesh. Daniel remembered stitching clumsy at first, his hands shaking. Dr. Hensley correcting his grip without shaming him. And through it all, Daniel remembered talking, soft, constant, like a lullaby made of ordinary words. You're okay. You're safe. I've got you. He remembered the scar he'd left on that shoulder. An imperfect line, a seam in a life that had almost ended before it began. Then years elapsed. Daniel went to school. He became something useful. He left rescue centers and entered larger systems, research programs, conservation teams, field work that felt significant. He went overseas for reasons he rarely explained and returned with a different kind of silence inside him. He returned to wildlife work because it was the only place he could breathe without pretending. And somehow, in all that time, he'd stopped thinking about the lion named Atlas, until now. Daniel's whistle faded into the arid air. Atlas's eyes widened just a fraction. And then the lion did something that made Daniel's heart halt. Atlas tried to lift his head toward the sound. Not toward the hyenas, not toward the stranger, toward Daniel. The movement was small, painfully slow, but it was intentional, like a door creaking open after years of being sealed shut. Daniel leaned closer, stunned. Atlas. He whispered the name, suddenly heavy with truth. It's me. The lion's gaze locked on him. For a breathless moment, the desert fell away. Daniel saw recognition, not human recognition with language and logic, but something deeper, scent, sound, rhythm, the memory of hands that didn't hurt, a pattern the animal's body had stored in its oldest, safest place. Atlas's nostrils flared faintly. His lips parted as if tasting the air, and Daniel, shaking, now reached a careful hand toward the lion's shoulder. He knew exactly what he was searching for. His fingers found it beneath fur and dust, a raised seam of scar tissue, the shape unmistakable even through years of sun and battle. A line that belonged to a young volunteer with trembling hands and a stubborn belief that lives could be repaired. Daniel's vision blurred. "Oh my God." He breathed the words barely audible. "It's you." Up on the ridge, the stranger let out a clipped laugh, skeptical. "You're jesting." Daniel jerked his head up. A flash of fury sliced through his grief. "Back off," he commanded, his voice suddenly tranquil. "Now." The stranger's mirth evaporated. He glanced between Daniel and the lion, decoding the change in Daniel's pitch. "You think you run things out here?" "No," Daniel replied. "But the world is arriving, and you don't want to be present when it does." As if summoned by the phrase, the distant engine rumble returned. Nearer now, louder. Undeniably a truck navigating rough terrain. Another noise joined it, faint but distinct. The chirp of a radio squawk carried by the breeze. The stranger's frame tensed. He took one step back, then another. His hand slipped off the rifle sling, not reaching for the firearm now, but hitching it higher, as if prepping for speed. Daniel didn't tear his eyes away. "Go," he said. The man paused only a second, then pivoted and began ascending the slope, quickening his stride until he vanished behind the boulders, as if he'd never existed. Daniel exhaled tremulously and turned back to Atlas. The lion's eyes were still open, still fixed on him. The feverish warmth of the animal's body pressed against Daniel's palm like a mute question. "Is this real?" Daniel's voice cracked softer now. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not leaving again." The vehicles were closer. Daniel could hear tires grinding gravel, the brief blip of a horn, as someone spotted motion. He raised his arm and waved with everything he had left, even as his ankles shrieked and his entire frame shuddered with fatigue. A ranger truck crested the Rise white dust-coated official emblems on the door. A second truck trailed with a trailer and gear. Two figures leaped out, moving fast, cautious but honed. One of them shouted Daniel's name. "Carter!" Daniel's knees nearly gave way with relief. He raised a hand again, voice hoarse. "Here. I need—" He swallowed hard and looked down at Atlas. "I need a vet team right now." The ranger's gaze dropped to the lion and widened. "Is that—" Daniel didn't let him finish. "Yes," he said, tears finally spilling free. "And he saved my life." Atlas's eyelids fluttered once, as if the noise of more humans ought to have ignited dread. But it didn't. His gaze stayed on Daniel, anchored there, steady despite everything. And Daniel realized the strangest thing of all. The miracle wasn't that Atlas had stood up. The miracle was that in the moment he should have been most alone, Atlas had found something to cling to, something familiar enough to pull him back from the precipice. A sound, a name, a debt that had waited 20 years to come due. The first ranger reached Daniel just as his legs finally failed. Strong hands caught him under the arms before he hit the dirt, easing him down with practiced care. Daniel barely registered it. His focus never left Atlas. The lion lay on his side now, chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged rhythms, each breath sounding like it had to battle its way out. "Easy," Daniel murmured, even as the world around him filled with voices, boots, and motion. "Easy, buddy." The ranger followed Daniel's gaze and froze. "Jesus," he muttered. "That's Atlas." The name rippled through the small group like an electric current. Within seconds, the scene transformed from chaos into controlled urgency. A second ranger waved the truck closer. Another spoke rapidly into a radio, his voice tight with adrenaline and disbelief. Somewhere behind Daniel, metal clanged as a trailer gate dropped open. A woman knelt beside Atlas, her movements calm, efficient. She wore dusty field attire and latex gloves already smeared with antiseptic, a wildlife veterinarian. Daniel recognized her immediately, even through the haze of exhaustion. "Dr. Morales," he breathed. She glanced up at him, eyes sharp. "Carter, what the hell happened?" Daniel opened his mouth to answer and realized he didn't know where to start. "He stood," Daniel said finally, his voice raw. "He shouldn't have been able to, but he did." Dr. Morales didn't question it. She pressed her fingers against Atlas's gums, checked his pupils, then nodded to the ranger behind her. "He's septic fever sky high. If we don't move him now, he won't last the hour." The word won't hit Daniel harder than any hyena's teeth. "Move him," Daniel said immediately. "Do whatever you have to do." Dr. Morales met his eyes. He might not survive the transport. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then we make the transport count." The vet held his gaze for a beat longer, then nodded. "All right." Sedatives were prepped quickly, doses adjusted on the fly for a body weakened by infection and age. When the needle slid into Atlas's shoulder, Daniel felt his own breath catch, as if the drug were entering his veins instead. He kept talking the entire time. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be there. "It's okay," he said. "You remember this part. The ride's rough, but it ends somewhere safe." Atlas's breathing slowed as the sedative took hold. His eyes fluttered, then closed. His body went heavy, fully surrendering at last, not to death, but to trust. They moved him carefully, 6 people coordinating each step, muscles straining under the weight of history and flesh. The stretcher creaked but held. Dust swirled around their boots as they hoisted Atlas into the trailer, securing straps with reverence that bordered on ceremony. Daniel watched from the ground, ankle wrapped hastily, water pressed into his shaking hands, by a ranger who kept telling him to drink. The engine roared to life. As the truck pulled away, Daniel climbed into the passenger seat, ignoring the protest from his body. He twisted around to keep Atlas in sight through the open trailer gate, refusing to look anywhere else. The drive was brutal. The road cut through rock and wash. Every jolt sent vibrations through the trailer. Dr. Morales rode with Atlas braced on one knee, monitoring vitals, adjusting fluids, murmuring to him, the way people did when science reached its limits and only presence remained. Daniel sat rigid, one hand gripping the dashboard, the other pressed to his chest, like it might keep his heart from tearing itself loose. He remembered another drive years ago, another animal, another night, when he'd sat in the back of a vehicle, with his hands stained and his future uncertain, wondering if carrying this much was sustainable. He had almost quit then. The sanctuary came into view as the sun began to sink, washing the desert in copper and gold. Gates opened. Lights snapped on. More people appeared. Keepers, technicians, volunteers who recognized the trailer before it even stopped. "Atlas is back," someone whispered. They moved him into the medical bay with practiced speed. The room smelled of antiseptic and clean water. A sharp, hopeful contrast to dust and decay. Machines hummed softly as they connected to Lionel flushed. The infected wound began antibiotics strong enough to wage war inside his blood. Daniel watched from the doorway, hands braced against the frame, feeling useless and necessary all at once. Hours passed. The sun disappeared. Night settled in quietly, as if it understood the weight of the moment. One by one, people filtered out, leaving only the essentials. Dr. Morales emerged, finally pulling off her gloves, exhaustion lining her face. "He's stable," she said. "Not safe, but stable." Daniel sagged against the wall, relief crashing over him so hard it made him dizzy. "He fought like hell," she added. "Whatever you did out there, it bought him time." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said softly. "He bought me time." They treated Daniel's ankle, eventually binding it correctly and demanding repose. He disregarded the bulk of their advice. When finally granted entry to the recuperation pen, he advanced sluggishly, respectfully, akin to entering a shrine. Atlas rested on deep padding, an IV tube feeding his limb, his chest expanding more rhythmically now. The fever had receded enough to permit slumber. He appeared diminished here, less like a monolith, more like an ancient spirit finally permitted to rest. Daniel dragged a seat close and settled in. He remained mute for a long duration. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about valor or marvels or how the cosmos had arranged itself into something nearly lyrical. "It took me time," he murmured, "to grasp what you bestowed upon me back then." Atlas didn't stir yet. Daniel was certain the lion's respiration altered ever so slightly, as if he comprehended. "I believed rescuing you meant repairing you," Daniel went on. "Preserving your life, releasing you." He chuckled softly. "It appears you were the one repairing me." Days dissolved into weeks. Atlas endured the crisis. The sepsis surrendered to persistent care. The lesion started to knit, sluggish and flawed, yet genuine. He reclaimed some mass, his vision sharpened, yet there were verities no drug could expunge. Atlas would never stalk prey again. His rear limb mended, but it mended poorly, rigid, frail, a souvenir of boundaries age inflicted without remorse. Restoring him to the wild would be an execution of a different sort. Daniel required no persuasion. He submitted forms, dialed numbers, and called in favors accrued over years. He debated with managers and financial officers and folks who discussed beasts as inventory. He declined to let Atlas become a statistic or a footnote. Ultimately, the verdict was plain. Atlas would remain not in a cell, not on exhibit, but in a protected zone of the refuge where the terrain sprawled vast and hushed, where canopy and hydration were always accessible, where no juvenile males would flank him, a sanctuary for an aged monarch to set down his crown without being obliterated. Daniel shifted his role without wavering. Field ops surrendered to sanctuary duties, mornings inspecting irrigation, and afternoons lounging in the shade, hearing the earth respire. He checked on Atlas daily. Occasionally they shared stillness. Occasionally Daniel spoke of nothing, of everything, of the wasteland, of how humans attempted to outpace their histories, and the odd solace of recognizing some obligations never lapsed. Atlas attended the way beasts attended, with existence rather than response. One twilight, as the heavens blazed crimson and violet, Daniel whistled the three-note melody once more. Atlas raised his skull, slow but intentional, and anchored Daniel with a stare that was lucid, now firmer. Daniel grinned through the throb in his ribs. "Yeah," he said, "that's us." The ledger had been balanced not in neat rows or flawless geometry, but in gore, agony, and the obstinate refusal to leave a tale unfinished. The cycles of the year shifted silently, as is the custom of the desert, without fanfare, without regret. Summer surrendered to a milder autumn, and the brutal white glare of the heavens softened into prolonged afternoons painted in amber. The terrain respired differently then. Mornings were crisper shadows, stretched further a tranquility that demanded nothing from its inhabitants. Atlas sensed the transition before it was spoken. He moved with more deliberation now, yet with intent. Every stride held a memory of agony, certainly, but also of endurance. The rigid rear limb never truly relaxed, yet it no longer dictated his existence. He mapped the contours of his new realm the way he had mapped every other domain in his life, patiently, willfully, on his own terms. The sanctuary sector constructed for him was expansive and hushed. Native grasses swayed in the drafts. A shallow basin mirrored the firmament. A grove of ancient cottonwoods provided canopy dense enough to slumber beneath without rivalry. No juvenile males orbited him here. No challenges arrived in the dark. This location did not require Atlas to validate his might. Daniel arrived daily. Occasionally he carried meat. Occasionally he brought implements and repaired items that required no mending, merely to be close. And frequently, most frequently, he simply sat at a remove, allowing the quiet to converse. The world had decelerated for Daniel as well. He still walked with a slight limp, a souvenir that bodies recall even when minds attempt to erase. His current labors were more subdued, less theatrical. There were no pursuits, no standoffs, no reports drafted with trembling fingers at day's end. There was maintenance surveillance existence. It fit him. On mornings when Atlas was agitated, Daniel knew before the staff did. He would arrive to find the lion already roused, gaze locked on the skyline, as if hearkening to something audible only to him. On those days, Daniel lingered, speaking in low tones, anchoring both of them in the present. On mornings when Atlas slumbered heavily, Daniel would sit nearby and let the moment suffice. No one needed to voice the reality, but it dwelled between them nonetheless. Atlas was ancient. The years he had borne before the desert clash had not been nullified by survival. They had simply been dignified by time. His frame carried the mass of a life thoroughly experienced, every scar a phrase in a tale that no longer required narration. The conclusion, when it materialized, gave no warning. It came on a chill dawn just prior to sunrise. Daniel detected the stillness first, not the eerie sort, no siren, no edge, just a silence that felt total. Atlas lay beneath the cottonwoods, his giant form slack, his ribs motionless, his features relaxed in a manner Daniel had never witnessed. For a second, Daniel didn't comprehend. He stood there, breath misting faintly in the cold, waiting for the lift of the chest, that didn't occur, waiting for the slow blink of eyes that had always located him. Then realization settled in, not like a strike, but like a hand rested softly on his shoulder. Daniel approached gradually, as if Atlas might rouse if startled. He knelt beside him, one knee touching the soil, and rested his palm against the lion's throat. The heat had dissipated. Atlas had departed in the night, without conflict, without dread, no injuries, no hysteria, merely repose. Daniel bowed his head. He didn't weep immediately. He sat there for a long duration, letting the wilderness wake around him. Birds commenced their morning anthems. The breeze stirred the leaves. Somewhere distant, a truck engine hummed to life. Existence continued. When the tears arrived, they were mute. Not the sort that clamored for notice, just sorrow doing what sorrow always did, marking love. The interment occurred later that day on the rise where everything had altered. Daniel insisted on it not because the sight was theatrical or symbolic in the way fables pretend, but because it was honest. This was where Atlas had been forsaken. This was where he had elected to stand regardless. They excavated the grave by hand. It took hours. The earth was obstinate, the stones unyielding. No one grumbled. Every thrust of the spade felt like part of a rite no one needed to title. When they lowered Atlas into the ground, Daniel stepped forward last. He placed his hand on the lion's brow one final time and leaned in whispering words that belonged solely to them. "You were never forgotten," he said. "Not once." They filled the grave with care, planted a young cottonwood at the head of it, and when the labor was finished, Daniel drove a simple timber marker into the soil. There were no ranks carved into it, no calendar dates, just a phrase burned into the grain. He was never abandoned. He was remembered. The chronicle did not terminate there. It never does. Rumors traveled, as they always do, sluggishly at first, then all at once. Rangers informed peers. Peers informed reporters. The desert lion who had stood for a man. The man who had once stood for the lion. Some folks questioned it. They spoke of instinct, of chance, of how humans projected significance onto animal conduct for comfort. Scientists debated memory. Cynics scoffed. Daniel listened politely and offered no rebuttal. He didn't require the world's consensus. He knew what he had felt beneath his hand. He knew what Atlas had enacted when every equation suggested he should have surrendered. He knew that something archaic and genuine had passed between them, something that didn't require language to persist. Years later, visitors occasionally paused near the cottonwood tree. They read the sign. They posed queries. They stood quietly longer than intended. Daniel would tell them the veracity, not the varnished version, not the myth. He told them about an aging lion who had been wounded and cast aside. About a man who had made errors and carried phantoms. About a moment when both had been at the limit of their endurance and chose without logic to shield something outside themselves. And then Daniel would voice the only thing that truly counted. "Kindness doesn't vanish," he would tell them. "It waits." The desert, vast and impartial, held the memory without critique. Wind swept over rock, seasons rotated, the cottonwood flourished, and somewhere beneath its roots rested a lion who had lived as a monarch, stood as a sentry, and left the world quieter, but better for having refused to be forgotten. Before you depart, allow me to pose a straightforward query. If this narrative moved your spirit, simply enter 1 in the reply section. And if you trust that benevolence invariably cycles back even after ages have passed, enter 0. No lengthy explanations are required. We will grasp the sentiment. If you are a person who derives solace from hushed, significant tales such as this, please reflect on joining our community. We recount genuine chronicles regarding wildlife existence and the intervals that recall what is truly vital. Gratitude for your presence and for honoring the memory of Atlas alongside us.